Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Grow My Salon Business podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Whitaker, and as always, it's great to have you here with us today. And whether you're watching on YouTube or listening as you walk the dog, or perhaps you're driving the car or running on the treadmill or whatever it is that you're doing, I just want to start off by saying thank you for being a listener. Our podcast is growing and we always need your help to continue growing because we want to get to help as many people as we possibly can in the industry. So if you're on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel and share it with your friends. And if you're listening on your favorite podcast app, then give us a 5-star review and a follow. And that would be very kind of you and very much appreciated. So with that said, on with today's show. Now, my guest today is a returning guest, Tom Bentley-Taylor, who, amongst other things, originally got the Salon Software brand Shortcuts established in the UK and is currently managing director at Vish in the UK. But in today's podcast, we're not really going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about the importance of using data in business today. We're going to talk about what the most important data is to be tracking in a salon business and what are some of the low-hanging fruit when it comes to data management in the salon industry, and lots more. So without further ado, welcome back to the show, Tom.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Thanks for having me and great to see you.
No, really good to have you on the show. I know you have been before. For our listeners who aren't aware, Tom was an early guest on the show quite a long time ago. I actually can't remember off the top of my head what date it was, but we spoke intensively about Vish, which is a brand that you are responsible for in the UK. But today we're not really going to talk about Vish, and because I think we've covered off on that. But
Yeah.
I weren't aware how diverse your experience is, not just in the hairdressing industry, but in the world of business. And so I thought it would be really good for us to dig into that. So I figured we'd sort of start off with perhaps something that's obvious, and that is that in the salon industry, the salon business, data or data, depending on where you live in the world, and hairdressing don't usually go hand in hand. In fact, it's often the sort of Achilles heel of a lot of salon owners. So I just want to ask you, why do you think that is? Because you've worked in different areas of the hairdressing industry. So why do you think it is? And why should that, and is that starting to change?
It's a very good question. And I think, from my side, I suppose it's like, we're in a world now where data is everything, right? Every business is a data business to a degree. If you want to get ahead, you need data and things. I think as an industry, having, sort of been putting technology into salons and running tech businesses in the salon industry for sort of 25 years, I found, I started my career sat at the end of a bed calling salons saying, stop using your paper book. You need this whizzy computer system, right? And it'll give you all this data and it'll do all this stuff and there's automation and blah, blah, blah. People were very sort of slow to adopt in the industry. And I put it down to us being a creative industry and it's a very human industry. So, people typically are, and I'm going to generalize now, but people are, behind the chair, they develop their careers, they want to earn more money and, whatever. And so therefore they open a salon, they become a business person, they carry on cutting hair. They typically the majority of locations, that's what the majority of the industry, if you're a salon owner, is that, right, you're probably still the main breadwinner for the salon. You've got limited time and all that sort of thing. And really it's about the creative art. If I do well at retaining my guests and I cut hair really well, I'm going to have a successful business, whereas actually, successful businesses are really about other elements, controlling costs, maintaining margin, not tying up cash in the wrong areas, those sort of 3 pillars to success, if you like. And I've, in my careers, lots of people I've spoken to where I've said to them, look, you really need to come off the floor for 2 or 3 days and start analyzing your business. Even when they've taken on technology, and they have data there that can drive their business, they don't invest the time in looking at it. And whether that's just because they're not sure, I think that kind of probably leads on to the value of business education for me. It's kind of, I've always viewed business My background's in education. I was a windsurfing instructor in my late teens, early 20s,
Wow.
and then sort of fell into business development, started my own business.
Yeah.
And I just loved the people side and educating people on these things I thought were really cool and that could help them, right? Which was technology and computers. And I think, where you go, right, okay, I've always viewed business as a sort of, it's a creative endeavor business. The world is ever changing. You can see it rapidly changing now with AI and tech and all this sort of stuff going on. And to be good at business, you've got to evolve with that, and you've got to be continually reinventing yourself, right? And analyzing, reanalyzing, thinking critically about stuff. Do you know what I mean? And I think, we invest very heavily in the creative side, the education of hairdressing, but we don't, and that's a creative endeavor, but we don't typically invest in our own education in business, which is also a creative endeavor. So I think this sort of concept that, while I'm a creative, I do the creative side, and the business side is sort of just the numbers that sit over there. I think, you've got to kind of start taking an interest in data, and it tells a story. Do you know what I mean? It isn't boring. It's just understanding the story it's telling you, and then decisions that you can make around it and how you do things. So I think, from my side, back to your question, why, I guess, kind of from a tech standpoint, I think we're slow to adopt because that just sort of, sits there. It's our point of sale or whatever it may be. And I think, particularly now with a lot of the technology that's out there, it does phenomenal things. So actually you need to get education around that, go on courses, invest time and effort in that, and you'll find it transforms your business. It's actually really interesting, when you get to the nitty gritty of what data means. I think the other thing is, if you've been behind the chair and suddenly you're getting into business and that sort of thing, can be very overwhelming, the amount of data that's there. And what do I do with it? And I think for, as a technologist, it's really about going, okay, what are the 2 or 3 things I can do now to make a difference to my business? So how do we get all of that data and boil it down to these are the things I need to focus on? And I think that's really what we need to sort of teach people. I'd love to see there being more business education and more salon businesses investing in business education as much as they do as the creative side, because there's a complete imbalance there. And then, for me, we're in a very low margin, high volume business. So, because of that small margins, minor changes can make a big difference one way or the other, whether we're going to keep our doors open or not. So we really need to get into the detail, get into that granular level of detail to be able to affect things.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to dig into a lot of what you've just touched on. I was thinking as you were talking about that, the amount of time that you've been in the industry, obviously there's these generational changes. And I think one of the reasons why, you said you were sat on the end of your bed calling salon owners and trying to get them to, start to do online booking or appointment.
They thought I was completely mad.
Of course they did, yeah. but some of that's a generational thing. So I was sort of wondering, with a 20-year-old, a 25-year-old, a young person today opening a salon of their own, they've never known a world without tech. They've, all their life they've had computers, and most of their life they've had social media to whatever degree. And so I was just wondering about that, because there's obviously a lot of salons out there that are still not computerized. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to get accurate data about certain things. But, I think you'd probably be lucky if there were 50% of salons that were fully computerized. There's still a lot of them that have got a drawer and a pad and pencil for an appointment book sort of arrangement. No matter where you are in the world, there's a heavy dose of that. So what are your thoughts about that in terms of the new generation of salon owners now? Are they just like, yeah, of course you'd do online booking. Of course you'd have a salon management software system. Of course you'd use a color management system like Vish or whatever. Are you seeing that, or is it is it not such a generational thing?
I suppose there's a couple of things there. I think, from my perspective, yes, you'd expect the younger generation to adopt technology better and everything like that. I think, my experience of different generations and technology is older generations are just as good with technology as the younger generations, but they're more methodical. If you look at users taking on new technology, if you've got somebody who is an older generational stylist or something like that using a piece of tech in their salon, they tend to be slower. They won't press everything, right? And they're more hesitant to use it, but they will learn, and they get it and they'll use technology. And I think whereas the younger generation, the new people coming onto the floor, will fly at stuff at a million miles an hour and probably make a lot of mistakes, right? So I think from a user perspective, there's that sort of thing. I think from a salon owner perspective, I think I wouldn't necessarily put it down to generational. I think, there's a sort of, if I'm just opening a salon and I'm a young person, I'm going to open the salon. What am I going to get for that salon? Well, I'm going to get what the salon I've just been in has.
Yeah.
Because that's what I'm used to.
Sure.
So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to adopt the next technology and, do you know what I mean, and be open to that. I think within the industry, we're not very good at sort of taking our blinkers off, if you like, and saying, right, okay, let's look at other industries and how they do things, or, how can we evolve and innovate what we're doing? If I look at the way we price for services, for instance, we're doing it the same way that we were in the 60s. It's a fixed price service, typically, for the different services, and we're paying a price based on the skill level, probably experience of the stylist. Okay, so I'm a senior stylist or a director or whatever it is, and for my half head, this is what I'm charging. Whereas actually, the reality is we've got data. We can actually go, well, okay, we're delivering a personalized service to every single guest. Every single guest who comes in the Vish world, we're talking about color and things like that, will require a different amount of color, right, for that service. It might be a half head of whatever, but there's a certain amount of product that I'm using for one person versus another. It's all different. It's all personalized. We sit down, we have a personalized consultation. We discuss what we're doing. We look at the hair, we look at the thickness of the hair, you know what I mean? What are we trying to achieve? We're working out the different products that we're using. There's different amounts of those. So all of that stuff is personalized, right? And yet our price is not personalized. Our price is fixed. Well, we should be innovating around that, right? That's not good for our business. If you look at hospitality or something like that, which I would say is the equivalent. If we want to look at other industries and what are they doing, again, it's a low margin, high volume business. You go to a restaurant, they're feeding lots of people, 2, 3, whatever sittings an evening. And, it's really kind of right. Okay, they may have a fixed price, but then they've got a fixed amount of product, right? They've got a fixed amount of, meat and vegetables and potato, whatever's on your plate, and rice and whatever, So they can have a fixed price because they've got a fixed cost. Whereas in our industry, we're selling time and we're selling product, and each guest requires a different amount of time and product. So therefore, personalized pricing should be there, right? A lot of our world now with tech is personalized, right? You go onto your social media, it's all personalized to you, specifically you, based on what you've said, touched, clicked, all those different things, right? Where you've been. Your phone is tracking all of these things, and you're getting personalized stuff coming straight. And you look at your phone, right? The app, everybody's phone looks different when you look at it. They've got different apps. Everything's personalized to you. And I think, our industry needs to evolve into, right, we're delivering amazing experiences for our guests and our staff, hopefully, right? Because that will retain them. And so let's make that more personalized, because we're living in a world of personalization.
Yeah. Okay. You've sort of answered some of this already, but I'm going to ask it again anyway. And that is that I weren't aware that you were responsible for launching Shortcuts, salon management software in the UK, and building it to have a significant presence. So between Shortcuts and now you're managing director of Vish in the UK, you've had a lot of exposure to a lot of salon owners over the years, specifically in the UK. So what I wanted to ask you about is, what are some of the common myths that people have about data and about tech?
Yeah, I think I think the biggest thing I would say is, Leo, that the tech doesn't run itself, right? And I think there is a sort of element of, right, I buy this and it's just going to work.
Mm,
And tech doesn't work like that. Okay. It's sort of, you've got to have inputs to
yeah.
get the right output. It is a tool which you use. So I think the biggest misconception that people have is they invest in tech and you stand it up, you train your staff, and it's just going to work. Whereas actually, you need to give the inputs to get the right output. And I think that's sort of one of the key things. So, and it can be overwhelming if you're putting technology in and it's like, right, I've got all this data. I think the good businesses out there wrap the services around it to help you. And you need to invest the time and effort in looking at the data, right? Actually, they'll help you go through it all. I do a lot of work with salons looking at how they're pricing things, what are their commission structures, those sorts of things. I'm very passionate about, if we can make a salon business very profitable, then we can actually invest that money in creating careers for staff. It isn't just a job, this is a career. And how do we do it? So I think, I think the first thing is, you invest in technology. That isn't just a monetary investment. You need to invest your time. It will give you a massive return if you do that. Okay. And a lot of the quality businesses out there in the industry are there to help. They will support you and say, okay, what are you trying to achieve? Let's start. It goes back to that. Give me a couple of things to focus on, right? And focus on those things and make your team aware of what you're doing and those sorts of things. So actually it becomes, okay, right, now I can look at this data and what are we trying to achieve and how do we do it? So I think technology isn't there and data isn't there just for data's sake. What we want is an outcome.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about a friend who has a salon group in the UK who's very data driven. And I would say, if you become data focused, you get more and more into it. And it's showing data visually. For me, it's about behavior change, right? A lot of the time I get this data. How can I then get my team to change behavior to get a better result, or this person, or how can I give my guest a better experience, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we actually change and evolve, and what do we do? So the visualization of data, I think, is really, really important, because people do struggle with seeing it's all these numbers and things like that. But I think, a lot of the technology now is very visual. And I think, my advice to people would be invest in whatever software you've got. A lot of people will get software and then after a while they go, well, it isn't really working for me. And they'll either change to another provider or stop using it. And they've not resolved the problems they initially set out to resolve, right? So a lot of the software that you've got, if you invest time and effort in it, you will get the outcome, you will get the return, but you need to invest the time. Just swapping to another provider or stopping using it isn't going to solve the problem you initially set out to do.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. I'm glad you mentioned, I was going to talk about him right now, Toby Dicker, who was the friend we were talking about before we started recording. And for the audience listening, I'm going to interview him on a podcast tomorrow, which will come out a couple of weeks after. And we were saying how Toby is, and I don't apologise for using the phrase, he would probably take great pride in it. He is a bit of a numbers or a data nerd. And I think that probably would apply to you as well. And that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. It's often what's missing.
I wear that badge proudly.
Exactly.
Yep.
And I've had him on the podcast before, but we're going to have him talking about a totally different topic in a couple of weeks. But I was going to ask you, so I am asking it for you now, and you can reference his salon if you want, which is, can you sort of paint a picture of a salon that uses data really well? What kind of things would you see them doing differently to what other salons don't?
I think it's another great question. I think back to that point on visualization, and I think probably more than that, communication. So data is good, but you have to communicate then to whether it's a user and you want them to change the way they're doing things to get a better result, or maybe it's just speaking about the data to your team. I think that communication is key, really. The good people are good at presenting data and talking to their team about it and what it means. So if we're talking about someone like Toby, I would say he's very clear and transparent with his team about what's going on, what they need to achieve, like visually showing them what they've achieved, where they need to be. And as they progress in the business, what's the data they need to get to the next level to progress their career, right? Not many salon businesses do that. It's kind of, well, my progression in the salon is because I'm super busy, right? And I'm friends with the owner, as opposed to, right, okay, well, let's have a progression based on data. If we have a certain level of retention, if we have a certain level of utilization, at that point, we will then elevate you to the next level and you'll start earning more money. I'm quite big on, right, okay, other industries, we have career progression. In the salon, we're working and earning a percentage of what we bring in, but is that actually a career? Where's my progression? What does that mean? And I think that's where some salons really struggle with retaining staff, is because it's not clear, the data is not really presented, or it's not even defined, what that progression is. So I think, for me, that communication piece is key to any successful business. All the successful businesses that I see who are very data driven are good at not only analyzing the right things, but presenting those to people, having clarity and transparency about what it means. And in the case of staff like that, how you progress in the organization.
Yeah. I actually heard Toby saying something very recently. Sometimes you hear the same thing, but you just all of a sudden, it has a different meaning. It really impacts on you. And he was talking about profit. And he said that what you have to remember is if a salon is only making 1% profit, and there's plenty of salons that are only making 1% profit, he said, you've got to be doing another $1,000 or pounds or euro, whatever your currency is. You've got to be generating another $1,000 to make $10 back as profit. And it was sort of like, when he said that, I was like, oh my God, he actually didn't say 1,000. He was talking about 100. He said, if you want $1 profit, you got to produce 100. And, if you're only running at 1%. And it was just such a simple statement that sort of slapped me around the face a little bit. It's like, oh my God, that is such an important visualization to understand what that looks like. It's hard to produce another $1,000. And if I'm going to do all that work and only make $10 profit out of it, or £10 or €10, it sort of really makes you rock back on your heels a little bit and think, okay, I need to get serious about this because I'm not working that hard for $10.
Exactly. And I think it's a good point, right? We, as an industry, we focus on being really busy, having our chairs filled and revenue. And I think actually, although revenue is a factor in any business, profitability is absolutely crucial. So actually, okay, if I'm bringing in, 100,000 of whatever it is each year, in whatever currency, well, actually, what's my profit on that? And actually, once you start getting down, the good thing about, the thing about data is you can get to a granular level. So I'd want to know, out of that 100,000, well, okay, well, let's have a look at all of the people and all of their bills and what's our profitability on a per guest basis, right? And we want to maintain margin on every single one. So when I'm analyzing data in businesses, I'll look at, okay, again, looking at the 3 pillars. So are we controlling our costs, and how do we control our costs, right? So that is, we're selling time, we're selling products. Let's use the right amount of time and the right amount of product. We've got 8 hours or whatever it is, or 10 hours of work today. Let's make sure every single hour we're maintaining or we're controlling our costs, right? Because that will have an impact on our profit margin.
Yeah.
And if we let that go and people are running over and running behind and all that sort of thing, and we're not charging by time, then actually suddenly it's very easy for the business to be at a loss on that guest. So the proportion of guests, when we're looking at data at Vish, there's about 20% of colour guests that aren't profitable by the time you've paid your member of staff and all that sort of thing. So profit is key. Controlling those costs is a key thing. I think the other thing is then the maintaining margin. If actually that guest does need an extra 15 minutes or an extra half a tube of colour or whatever it is, we need to know exactly what that cost is, and we need to pass that on in some shape or form in terms of an upcharge to the guest. However, and there's various different mechanisms for doing that, but that will then maintain our margin. So I think controlling costs, maintaining margin, so charging accurately is what I call it. Okay. And I think then the third bit is really about, we get a lot of money tied up in areas of the business where, and it just, particularly stock, where it just sits there, right? So actually that's not good. You want to maintain cash flow, and that is not tying it up in stock. So I think those three things are the key things that you need to look at. It isn't just your revenue and how busy you are. I know lots of salons, particularly at the moment, not just in the UK, we've got salons in the US, Australia, etc., who are incredibly busy and not making a profit or making a very slim profit. And you know what? When you actually start looking at the data, if you don't increase your profit margin, you're going to need you're going to need to double your number of stylists to generate additional profit. So it's not really just trying to get busier and busier will run everybody into the ground, doesn't create a successful business. We've got to make sure that every single guest that comes in is actually delivering profit to the business. And then we can start getting a healthy business where people were working, a reasonable number of hours, getting paid a reasonable salary, and away we go. So that's really how I approach things. Is a lot of people are like, oh, we need more guests, this drive to have your seat full the whole time. To me, it's kind of, and I've talked to Toby and lots of other people about this before. It's almost like, right, if I've got good retention, I'm doing a great job, and I'm over 80% utilized, why don't I up my price by 10%, right? Well, I probably can based on that data, right? And I may lose 10% of my guests, but guess what? I'm making as much money, if not more. And then I've got 10% more time to sell at that higher rate. So suddenly we're getting into a position of becoming more and more profitable. So I think, the natural inclination is to be really, really busy and not lose any guests. It's not a bad thing to lose guests based on, right, actually, we're at a point where we can raise our price and go up a level and we lose a few guests, right? Okay, fine. But you want the right guests sat in your seat, or you need to charge the right amount for what you're delivering. If I don't know what the cost is, then I'm in big trouble, right? Because and I think that's the thing. That's where the data comes in. You need that data to be able to then maintain your margin. And back to that point is right. Actually, in the 60s, we win on some, we lose on others. But actually, people weren't losing on others back in the day, because the cost of product now, as a proportion of the services that we charge, the cost of product is inflated at a far higher rate than what we're charging. So the cost of product, for instance, is a much higher percentage of what we're charging than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. Totally. So I think you've seen cost of product go up like that. What we're charging has gone up like that. And that's where we're less people are doing really well in the industry. And it's not to say that nobody's doing well, but I think less people are doing well, than they were 10 or 20 years ago because of that.
Yeah. And, in line with what you're talking about then, with the product thing and the economy being a bit tight for a lot of people, they're stretching out their time between appointments. So, of course, the client then turns up, and instead of having a half-inch regrowth for a root touch-up, she's got a 1-inch regrowth. So now twice the amount of product's got to be used, and she needs to pay for it. So it's sort of a false economy in a lot of ways for the clients to stretch out the time between appointments unless they're being charged for that extra
Yeah.
product,
And well,
which
yeah,
they
and
need
I
to be.
think, but I think also, right, there's a communication piece attached to that. Again, it sort of goes back to that same thing of, well, actually, if my guest understands they come back within 6 weeks, their routes are like this,
Mm,
therefore this is the price we charge. If they then don't come back for 12 weeks and we have to charge them more, well, okay, they understand that, but there's a choice then for that guest
mm,
because we've communicated. So do they now return within 6 weeks and get that price that we tell them, or do they stretch it out? Okay, but if I'm breaking it down, here's the cost for the extra product, and we're saying exactly here's the breakdown of what you've had today. I
mm.
think that helps with that communication, the transparency. It may have taken you the same hour
Yeah.
to actually do that service that it would have taken, or half an hour in the case of a root touch up. Let's say it takes you half an hour. It's the same half an hour, but now it's going to take me twice the amount of product. If we separate that out, people understand it, right?
Mm.
Well, I needing more product because your roots are massive and you haven't come back for 10 weeks. But if you come back in 6 weeks next time,
Yeah.
then right, well, you're not going to have that huge cost of extra product.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. The education bit's essential, isn't
Yeah.
it? Okay. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was, I'm always telling salon owners that you need to track your numbers, etc. From your perspective, not just Vish, but like knowing salon owners and knowing how the salon industry works from a broader level. If you were talking to someone who was, a bit overwhelmed with the numbers side of things, what would you say to them? Let's say the top three. These are the three things you need to be all over. What would you say that they were? And I know you've already spoken a little bit about the three pillars, but try and sort of drill in on that. What would the three, metrics be that you'd be saying you need to look at, whether you're computerized or even if you're, not computerized?
I think it's sort of, for me, when you start looking at data and things, and as a sort of kickstart people with looking at data, I think you need to have an understanding of sort of benchmarking, like where are you right now versus other people. You don't know what good looks like to a degree. So what do I focus on? Okay, so what I mean by that is, what does good retention look like
Mm,
for a stylist, for instance? What is, if I look at my cost of color,
mm,
if I've got my Vish hat on, there's a cost of color and then my color revenue. Well, do I break out in my P&L, right,
mm.
my color cost, so not including retail and everything like that,
Yep.
and then look at my color revenue,
Yep.
right? And now we've got a percentage that we can look at. So I'd say from a Vish perspective, that's a really good metric. What
Mm-hmm.
percentage cost to revenue purely on color,
And what
right?
do you find the sweet spot is with that?
So it's quite horrifying when you start looking at, I think for owners and things, when you start looking at, okay, what does good look like? Most people would try and historically would say we want that to be at 10%. I would say a lot of businesses are 20% or higher.
Mm,
We've seen businesses at 35%. I mean, literally, they're going to need to close their doors.
yeah.
What good looks like is 5,
Mm,
right? So, and you can't get there without technology. You just can't do it. So back to your point, are we going to hire a whole load more stylists and get them working for our 1%? Or are we actually going to get the technology in to be able to get us to a 5% cost to revenue,
yeah.
control those costs? So for me, that's a key thing that I would look at. And then in terms of sort of, if you're looking at a profit margin, profitability and everything like that, again, you can do some of this stuff manually, but it's going to take you a very long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you probably haven't got the time, So, I would say, okay, if in a perfect world, I'd get all of my team to write down how many grams of each product they've used for each guest.
Good luck
And
with
then
that.
I'd figure out the cost per gram of each of those
Yeah.
and calculate it and then go, right, is this profitable? Is it not?
Yeah.
well, they've already left the business and we can't charge them anymore, and that one wasn't profitable.
Yeah.
So I think, that it's really looking at that, down to that granular level is right, actually, which ones are profitable and which ones are not. And I think then, looking at how much money have you got tied up in stock versus your turnover over that. So if I go, right, okay, well, how frequently are you ordering? I'm ordering monthly. Okay, so I order monthly. What's my order value? And then looking at my order value versus the cost of the product that I'm holding in stock. And what does that look like? And then we can, we would then give benchmarks for each of those. What do you need it to be? If we do these things, the profitability of the business is transformed. So that it does go back to this personalization. We're in a personalized world. We need to be personalized in terms of what we're delivering, the experience that we're delivering, and what we're charging for it. And if all those are personalized, you can have a very successful business, even with all the challenges around, tax and all those sorts of things going on.
Yeah. You touched on, the stylist, the team member. And what I want to ask you about is, whether you're like, regardless of what the tech is, when you start integrating more tech and more data into your business, what do you find? I guess the answer is something to do with accountability. What do you find the resistance point is that the salon owner has and the staff member has? But first of all, I suppose that the salon owner has to you if you're trying to get them to take it, and then what's the point of resistance the salon owner gets from their team member? To start with, the team member probably doesn't understand it and gets overwhelmed with it all very quickly, oftentimes. How would you suggest that's handled? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think people don't like change, do they really? Generally,
Yeah,
I think a lot of people don't like change, and part of that's probably the unknown, right? I'm happy doing what I'm doing right now, and if I change things, what's going to happen, and all those sorts of things. So I think it is about communicating to people what you're doing and why, and I think you've got to look at it as, particularly with sort of technology, but change generally. A lot of technology, it is about behavior and things like that. For me, it's really kind of the adoption side of things. It goes back to investing your time, right? You've got to go, okay, look, let's be realistic. We're very realistic with stylists. Look, this is what you need to do. Okay. It's going to take some change. You're going to have to stick with it, but this is the result you're going to get when you come out the other side. It's a bit like when you pick up, a social media app for the first time, when they first came out and everything. It's like, how on earth do you use this thing? You know what I mean? But you sort of, it sucks you in social media. It sucks you in, and you're kind of like, right, now we're all addicted to it. But from that perspective, I think it's just, I always call it a change hump. So there is a hump when you're going through change, and that's kind of right. Initially, you're really excited and you start to use it, and then you're like, oh, right, well, actually, it doesn't do this or it doesn't do that, or it's slowing me down, or whatever the reasons are. And then you go over that hump, and then you start to really see the outcome of the technology. It tends to not be a huge amount of time. If I'm looking at salons adopting technology, it's normally 2 to 4 weeks where you go through that period, and then and then people are like, well, I wouldn't work without it now. We should have got this years ago. So from a user perspective, it's like that. And I think, from the owner perspective, it's really about results often take a long time. It doesn't happen overnight. If I make a change now, for instance, right? Okay. If I say, okay, if I'm going to get rid of the color waste in my business, I'm going to weigh the waste and adjust my formulas today. My guest doesn't arrive back for 15 weeks. So I'm not going to actually see a cost saving in my business for 15 weeks when they return. And now I'm using less product because I've got rid of the waste. So I think that's the other thing, we should be as realistic as possible. You will get the results, and they'll be permanent in your business. When you use technology well, it will have a permanent impact on your business. You've got to stick at it, and it will happen over time. There's ways in which you can speed these things up, but we're dealing with humans. Humans use technology. There's a human element. So how do we speed that up? Because we're all humans, sometimes it takes a lot longer. Some of the things we want to do and achieve quickly, our team just won't do that, right? So we've just got to be realistic over our timescale. It's right that we put technology in for the right reasons, and maybe things will happen very quickly, but often they'll take longer than we think. So I think if you've got that expectation, I think that's really useful.
Yeah, okay. And I agree with you. A couple of things I want to say. First thing was, to our American audience, when Tom said turnover, he meant total sales. Okay.
Yes.
Americans don't use the term turnover for that. They turnover for them means staff leaving, and so
It
throws out the whole equation. No, don't apologise at all. So that's what that was. Total sales, and yeah, people don't like change if they aren't aware of how it's going to make them better off. And that's the key to it, isn't it? If you're a salon owner, you've got to get that across to the team member, how it's going to impact on them positively. Because at the beginning, it might be a pain in the backside for them to have 100%. To change their way of working. But if they can see that it puts another 20 quid or whatever, $20, whatever in their pocket each week, then it's like, okay, I don't mind doing this. It works, So,
that's it. Yeah. I think it's the what's in it for me. What's in it for me. And I think, it's when we're putting technology in, the start of our process for onboarding is, we call it delighting the stylist. All our goal, because they're the user of the technology, our goal is to delight the stylist, right? What's in it for them? And I think, as business owners and managers, it's really important. Okay, what's going to motivate people to do this? What's in it for them, right? If you're putting technology in and it's new, right, actually, you can gamify it, right? Well, if you achieve X or Y, I don't know, there's a prize, there's something extra in your paycheck, etc. So, and I think, technology will drive the business and deliver a lot of extra profit if you use it properly. Okay, and revenue and all that sort of stuff, but really make the business more profitable. And so why not share some of that? Because actually you'll get there much quicker and it'll be much easier.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, we need to wrap up. Whereabouts can people connect with you, Tom? On Instagram or any other social media channels or website? Where would you like to send them?
Yep. So getvish.com. So we've got a web chat on there. They can connect to any of the team globally through that, and myself. We've got a very flat structure. So if any of the points that sort of we've discussed and things, people are like, oh, I'd like to know a bit about that, then just feel free to go onto our web chat, ask for me, and I'll get in contact.
Cool, fantastic. Okay, well, I'll put those links on our website, growmysalonbusiness.com, and in the show notes for today's podcast, wherever you're listening to it, whatever app that you're using. So if you're listening to this podcast with Tom Bentley-Taylor and have enjoyed it, do me a favor, share it with people that you know would also enjoy it and, more importantly, get some benefit from it. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a rating and review on the Apple Podcast app. So to wrap up, Tom Bentley-Taylor, thank you for being my guest on this week's episode of the Grow My Salon Business podcast.
Thanks so much, Anthony. It's brilliant. Love chatting to you as usual.
Yeah, thanks for being here.